They called him a monster. A king, yes, but one so warped in body, so strange in mind, so broken in spirit that whispers began to rise. He wasn't of this world. His jaw jutted so far forward he couldn't chew. His tongue was so swollen, words barely escaped. He walked like his legs had forgotten how to be human, and stared with eyes that looked empty. Not vacant, wrong. In court, ministers prayed he would never speak, because when he did, it reminded them of something unholy. They said his breath smelled like rot, that his skin was cold, that when he touched you, it felt like touching the grave. He was a king without a future, a man without a child, a ruler born from a bloodline that folded in on itself until the final product seemed less like royalty and more like a curse made flesh. So the people whispered in fear. Was he punished by God or chosen by the devil? Was Charles II truly the final heir of a decaying empire, or a breathing omen of its doom? This is not a story about war or glory. It's not about power or even politics. This is the story of a king whose very body told a terrible truth, a truth no one dared say aloud until now. Spain in the 17th century was no longer the empire it once was. For over 100 years, it had ruled with an iron crown, stretching its influence across Europe, the Americas, and the seas between. Gold flowed from the New World into Madrid. Armadas thundered across oceans. The Catholic faith was law the Habsburg name revered, and the king was second only to God. But by the time Charles II was born in 1661, the great machine of Spanish dominance was rusting at its core. The economy was strangled by inflation. The military bled money and men. Plague and famine stalked the land. And worst of all, the royal family had turned inward, both politically and genetically. The House of Habsburg, which had reigned across Europe for generations, believed in the purity of blood. To preserve their divine right, they married cousins, uncles to nieces, nieces to uncles again and again. In Spain, this practice became so extreme that by the time Charles II came into the world, his family tree looked less like a branching structure and more like a wreath folding back into itself. He was the product of that inbreeding, the final result of a dynasty eating its own tail. But at the time, no one could know just how severe it would become. Charles was born to King Philip IV and his second wife, Mariana of Austria, who also happened to be his niece. His birth was celebrated with hope, relief, and spectacle, a male heir at last. Spain had waited 17 long years since the death of the last legitimate son. This was to be the boy who would save the crown. But even as an infant, there were whispers. He cried too much, or too little. His limbs flopped when they should have curled. He didn't nurse well. His skin was pale and slack. His eyes seemed lost. Physicians tried to reassure the court. Delayed development, they said. Nothing uncommon. But behind closed doors, concern began to simmer. He didn't walk when he should. He didn't speak clearly. His skull was too large, his body too weak, and yet no one dared voice the truth. This was the heir to the Spanish Empire, the future of Catholic Europe. To admit he was unwell was to admit that the empire itself had begun to rot. So they hid it, covered it, masked it behind layers of ceremony silk and sacred ritual. Charles was displayed when he looked strong and concealed when he didn't. Even portraits were manipulated to make him appear taller, healthier, more kingly. But Spain's enemies weren't blind, and neither were its own nobles. France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire watched with sharpened curiosity. Was this boy truly capable of leading? Would he rule, or simply be ruled. Meanwhile, the Spanish court fractured into rival factions, some loyal to his mother, the austere and controlling Mariana, others allied with powerful nobles and foreign allies. All of them saw the same thing: a boy king who looked more like a ghost than a monarch. The political landscape only grew more volatile. Spain was crumbling under its own weight. Portugal had declared independence. The Netherlands were lost, and the French Bourbons, young, ambitious, and genetically healthy, waited like wolves just beyond the Pyrenees. In this world of decay, conspiracy, and blood, Charles grew up in a palace so drenched in incense and fear that reality seemed to bend around him. He was raised more as a relic than a child, surrounded by priests, watched by doctors, and guarded by superstition. He was taught little and understood even less, but he was king. At just 4 years old, he inherited the Spanish throne, and no one, not his mother, not his council, not even the church, could say what would happen next. Because deep inside the Alcazar palace, behind curtains of gold and smoke, the empire's most terrifying question had already begun to form: what if their king was already broken? The boy was never meant to rule, not truly, not on his own. From the very beginning, every decision, every ceremony, every royal decree, it all passed through someone else's hands. At first, it was his mother, Mariana of Austria, stern, pious, overprotective. She ran the court like a fortress of incense and suspicion. Every doctor who treated Charles was carefully selected. Every report was edited before it left the palace. Even servants were warned not to speak of what they saw, and what they saw was terrifying. Charles couldn't stand on his own until he was nearly 6 years old. He didn't speak a coherent sentence until almost age 8. His mouth drooped open, constantly saliva pooling at his lip. He had to be spoon-fed. He vomited frequently. His spine curved the wrong way. His head trembled when he focused on someone. Even blinking seemed slow, like his body fought against every human reflex. At night, some swore they heard him wailing in his chambers, not the cries of a child, but something deeper, a groan from a body that never felt at home in this world, a sound that curdled the blood. Yet in public, they dressed him in silks and gold and placed a crown atop that swollen skull. Long live the king, the courtiers shouted, bowing before a boy who could barely lift his arms in return. Behind closed doors, the court fractured. Mariana's grip on power enraged the grandees, the powerful noble houses who saw themselves as the true stewards of Spain. They hated her Austrian ties, her foreign allies, her religious rigidity. More than anything, they hated how she clung to the throne, using her sickly son as a puppet. Plots simmered, nobles whispered of replacing her regency, of elevating someone else to guide the boy, someone stronger, someone Spanish. And then came Don Juan. Not the fictional seducer. This Don Juan was the king's half-brother, an illegitimate son of Philip IV, charismatic, bold, handsome, and most importantly, healthy. He became a symbol of resistance against Mariana's rule. Crowds began to cheer his name. Nobles rallied behind him. They claimed he should be the one guiding Spain, not a foreign queen mother, not a dying dynasty. Don Juan marched on Madrid in 1677 with an army at his back and popular support in his hand. Mariana, fearing civil war, agreed to step aside. For a moment, hope flickered in the dying empire. Perhaps with Don Juan in charge, the boy could grow into something more. But within months, Don Juan was dead. Some said it was poison. others divine judgment. But the result was the same. Mariana returned, and Charles once again became the prize in a game of thrones that was slowly tearing his country apart. As the years passed, Charles grew older, but not better. He could not produce an heir. His body remained weak. His mind never sharpened. When ambassadors visited, they reported a man who barely reacted to conversation. Sometimes they said he drooled while listening. Sometimes he blinked at nothing at all. By his 20s, the rumors had curdled into fear. Foreign courts began to ask if Charles was cursed. His lineage was studied. Priests were called to examine him. The Spanish court quietly approved exorcisms, real sanctioned Vatican-blessed attempts to drive demons from the king's body. Nothing worked. In 1679, they married him to Marie Louise of Orleans, the French king's niece. She was beautiful, lively, and young, everything Charles wasn't, and she was horrified. Marie Louise wrote home, describing the Spanish court as cold and miserable. Of her husband, she said little, except that he seemed more dead than alive. She never bore children. Whispers spread that she was cursed by proximity. Some blamed her for Charles's barrenness. Others wept for her locked in a palace of smoke and rot. In 1689, she died suddenly at age 26. Poison was suspected perhaps by rivals in court or even by Mariana, but no one could prove it. Charles was devastated, or at least that's what his ministers claimed. He didn't cry, didn't speak, didn't move from his chair for hours, just sat there staring as if the soul behind his eyes had finally decided to retreat. They married him again quickly to Maria Anna of Neuburg, another Habsburg cousin chosen for her reputation of fertility. But even she couldn't change what centuries of inbreeding had done. By now, Charles's health was collapsing. His legs trembled. His skin broke into boils. He lost clumps of hair. He was often carried from room to room. He suffered seizures. His face became so gaunt, observers swore it looked skeletal. And still, he reigned. Because to remove him was to unmake the crown itself. His death would invite war. France and Austria both prepared claims to the Spanish throne. Every day Charles stayed alive. Spain stayed whole. Every breath he took was like holding back a landslide. And yet people began to wonder if death had already claimed him. His court described him as dead in mind. Some believed he was being slowly consumed by witchcraft. One physician claimed that his body contained no blood, only black matter. Others insisted he had been born with the devil's breath in his lungs. It no longer felt like rumor. It felt like fate. He was the last Habsburg king of Spain, and he looked like death wearing a crown. There was no sudden collapse, no grand dramatic moment, just a slow, relentless slide towards silence. Charles II didn't die all at once. His body simply gave up on him, piece by piece. By the final years of his life, the Spanish king had become a shadow. He was barely able to walk. He spent most days confined to bed or slumped in a heavily padded chair, cloaked in furs and silence. His skin had yellowed. His eyes sunk into the skull. His speech, already slow and garbled, had turned into mumbles and breathless whispers. He could no longer chew. Food was mashed into paste or fed through liquids. He choked often. Sometimes he stared for hours at candles. Sometimes he didn't recognize his wife. He was 35. His ministers were desperate. Spain was falling apart. Entire provinces had collapsed into economic ruin. The nobility was fractured. Foreign powers circled like vultures. The king's infertility was no longer a question, it was a certainty. He had no children, no heirs, no future, and yet no one dared say it aloud he must die. Not because they wanted him gone, but because the alternative was worse. As long as he remained alive, Spain remained technically whole, but with every passing month it was clear death was already in the room. It lingered in the hallways of the palace. It sat beside him at council meetings. It whispered in every prayer said on his behalf. The Queen Maria Anna grew paranoid. She began consulting mystics. She called in priests. She surrounded herself with astrologers and healers. She begged for saints to intervene, anything to stop the disintegration happening in front of her. In 1698, a necromancer was secretly summoned to court. The man examined Charles and declared him bewitched. According to the records, he claimed that evil spirits had entered the king's body through enchanted food, that spells had been cast upon him since birth. He said Charles's body was not inhabited by a natural soul, that something had taken his place. It sounds like madness, and perhaps it was. But they believed him. The queen ordered an exorcism. They stripped the king's bed, purified his chambers, and read sacred chants in Latin while Charles lay, motionless eyes open mouth, barely able to move. They poured holy water over him. They spoke directly to demons. They begged for release. There was no response. Charles didn't scream. He didn't weep. He simply stared as if the body was present, but the man had long since vanished. In public, the court put on a brave face. Processions continued. Masses were held. Announcements were read that the king was recovering, that he had eaten well, that the worst was behind them. But in private, his body was dying. His heart faltered. His eyesight dimmed. He slept more than he was awake. When he did rise, his muscles refused to follow. One witness said he moved like a puppet without strings. In October the 1700, he could no longer stand. His urine turned black. He vomited frequently. He stopped speaking. And still they waited. A few days before his death, Charles asked for the sacraments. He confessed. He received the Eucharist. He signed his will with a trembling hand, naming Philip of Anjou, a Bourbon, as his successor. It was the final nail in the coffin of the Spanish Habsburg line. On November 1st, 1700, as candles flickered in the royal chapel and whispers filled the corridors of El Escorial, Charles II died. He was 38. The room was quiet. No weeping, no outcry. Just the sound of breath leaving a body that had carried the weight of a decaying empire and the silence of an entire dynasty finally reaching its end. They performed an autopsy. What they found was unsettling. The report written by court physicians claimed his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs decayed, his intestines rotten and gangrenous, his head full of water. His body, they said, was drained of life long before it had stopped breathing. No one needed a prophecy anymore. The curse was complete. The last of the Spanish Habsburgs, born of centuries of inbreeding, crowned in decay, and haunted by whispers of hell, had finally passed into history. And with him, Spain began to unravel. His funeral was grand but hollow. Thousands attended. Masses were sung. But the air was thick with something else, not grief, but relief. As if the ghost had finally left the building. No heir, no strength, no future. Charles II's death in 1700s didn't bring peace, it ignited a war. The moment his lifeless body was laid to rest, Europe erupted. His chosen successor, Philip of Anjou grandson, of the French king was a Bourbon, not a Habsburg. France celebrated, but Austria, England, and the Dutch Republic were outraged. They feared France would control both thrones, French and Spanish, creating a superpower too massive to ignore. What followed was the War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal conflict that lasted over a decade, killed hundreds of thousands, and redrew the map of Europe. A war sparked not by ambition alone, but by a broken body on a crumbling throne. And yet, Charles himself faded. There were no grand monuments built to his name, no romantic retellings, no proud memory in the Spanish soul. His image, once painted in exaggerated splendor, was quietly set aside. He became a symbol of decline, the king who never truly lived, and whose reign was more like a funeral march. Even in death, Charles II was treated like an embarrassment. But history is cruelly fair. It doesn't forget. It waits. Centuries later, scholars return to his life not with scorn, but with questions. Geneticists studied his lineage and confirmed what had long been whispered. Charles had one of the most inbred family trees in recorded history, an astonishing inbreeding coefficient of 0.25, the same as a child born of a sibling-sibling relationship. His body wasn't cursed by God or haunted by demons. It was dismantled by biology. Generation after generation of deliberate incestuous marriage had finally produced the inevitable, a man too damaged to function, born a king in name only. But facts didn't kill the myth. To this day, Charles II is remembered in Spain not as a ruler or a statesman, but as a specter, a figure out of a Gothic legend, the king who never was. The man born from too much blood, cursed by too much power. Paintings of him now carry a different weight. His hollow eyes, pale skin, and misshapen jaw seem to stare straight through time, as if he knew what they were doing to him, what history would say, and what it would never forgive. Yet maybe that's the real tragedy. Charles II wasn't evil. He didn't start wars. He didn't order mass executions. He wasn't cruel or tyrannical. He was by all accounts passive, gentle, sometimes kind, always confused. A child in a man's body, a man in a world too brutal for his bones. And still they called him from hell. But perhaps the hell was never inside him. Perhaps it was the world that built him the dynasty that twisted him, the crown that crushed him, that carried the real curse. And perhaps Charles was not the monster, but its final victim. They buried him in silence. But the echoes of Charles II still haunt history, not because he ruled like a tyrant, not because he died in flames or blood, but because he existed at all a fragile echo of centuries of ambition, arrogance, and bloodlines too proud to bend. His life was not a warning from the devil. It was a mirror held up to the face of empire, showing what happens when power forgets to look inward. But Charles wasn't the only royal swallowed by the shadows of history. If you think his story was dark, wait until you meet Edward VI, a boy king whose crown came laced with poison plots and prophecy, a child who ruled England from a sickbed surrounded by whispers and traitors. Click here to uncover Edward's final days and the terrifying secret buried with him. And if you haven't already, subscribe. There are more haunted crowns, more broken heirs, and more forgotten stories waiting. This was just the beginning.